For this project, I intentionally used lumber that it was really easy to come by at any big box store. So this entire thing is made out of 2x4s, 1x4s, and 1/2-inch plywood. I cut all of the 2x4s to length using a speed square to make sure that it was square and a circular saw. If you've got a miter saw, that'll make it even faster. Once I had all these pieces cut, I started joining up the frames, and I did that with a pocket hole jig. Every time I use pocket holes, there are certain people that complain about them, but the fact of the matter is they're fast, they're simple, and they're usually strong enough. They don't have to hold up the world, they just have to hold a cabinet together. So I used pocket holes to attach the outside pieces of the frames. I made 2 frames and then connected those frames together. Notice I'm putting glue on the end grain here, which doesn't do a whole lot, but it also certainly does not hurt. I got both of the outside frames put together and then had to connect them to each other. I screwed on some longer pieces of 2x4 just to connect the 2 frames together, and I used a scrap piece of 1/2-inch plywood as a spacer on the back. There's going to be a panel that goes there, and so this gives me the location of where the frame needs to be. The placement of these 2x4s was a little bit different from end to end. The top front actually had it all the way up against the front, and that's because that's the one that's going to be seen. The rest of them will be covered with plywood. The 2x4s had a little bit of bend in them, so it looked really out of whack until I got the top frame put on and everything screwed together. Once the glue and screws were in place, it started to square up pretty nicely. After I got all of these 2x4s screwed in, then it was time to add the sheeting. I stood this thing up to see how tall it was. It was pretty huge. To put on the bottom panel, I needed to put in a few more 2x4s to support the weight of anything that I put on the bottom shelf. I screwed those in from the back and then from the front. I used an edge guide on my circular saw to cut down the full sheets into more reasonable sized panels. If you have a table saw, that's much easier, but mine's kind of hard to take outside. This made it so that I could cut down the pieces one by one to fit them into place. I put on the back panel and just screwed it into the 2x4s along the top and the bottom. This held it in place just fine, even though it was a little floppy in the middle. That'll get tightened up later on. I cut down a few more panels to fit into the sides. These are pretty basic. The only difference was that I needed a notch out to go around the 2x4s. I used my speed square just to mark out these and then cut them out with a jigsaw. This extra little bit on the end helped it to drop down inside the frame to make sure that there was a connection at the top and the bottom. This held the panel in place, and I just added some screws into the back of the 2x4s to hold them there. I put the other side in the exact same way, and every panel that you add to this makes it stronger and more rigid. I cut down a couple of more panels. One went on the bottom. I just screwed this straight down through the top into the 2x4s below. Then I had to cut down some cleats out of some 1x4 material, and these are going to hold the shelves in place. I could have also done this outside, but it's much easier with a miter saw and a table saw, so I just came in to cut them down to length and then cut them down to width. I measured up on one side and made a mark, and then I used the level to transfer that line all around to all 3 sides. I added some glue, lined these up with my marks, and then nailed them in place to dry. These aren't going to hold a ton of weight, so I wasn't too worried about them being overly strong. My oldest son was outside and asked if he could help, so of course I said yes. It's awesome because usually they're at school when I'm working, so this was a great time for us to work on something together and a relatively safe part of the project. Anytime you have the chance to get one of your kids working on something with you, take advantage of it. I'm sure glad that I did. Once we got these cleats up, I added a piece of plywood as the shelf, and then another piece of 1x4 on the front, and just used some glue and nails to hold it in place. I did the same thing for the other shelf as well. I cut down another piece of plywood to use for the top, and this had a simple frame around it that I cut with the miter saw. The last 2 panels to cut were the doors. Again, I used the edge guide to cut down 2 similar panels and then laid them out on my big table to add the trim. The trim here is mostly for decoration, but it will help counteract some of the bending that's bound to happen with plywood. The glue is what really does the work though. I added a couple of more pieces at the top and the bottom, and then one piece right in the center. I decided not to use pressure treated lumber for this project because I knew I was going to paint it, so I pulled out the paint sprayer and went to work. I sprayed what I could, but I had to roll the doors because I didn't really have another way to prop them up. I used some outdoor paint with some primer built in, so really one coat was pretty good. I laid the cabinet on its back and laid the doors in place. Because of how big this thing is, that just made the most sense. It also helped me make sure that the gaps between the doors and between the sides and the top and the bottom were all even. I put in several different hangers to hold different things, and I'll probably change that over time as I add more stuff to the cabinet. The top shelves are for dangerous chemicals, and it closes up pretty nicely. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and it's going to be super useful. Overall, this is a relatively simple project. There's nothing really complex about the build, it's just a lot of steps. If you have a table saw and a miter saw, that will make it faster for sure, but you could do this entire thing with a circular saw and a drill if that's all you've got. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.